Imagine a packed dance floor, the bass reverberating through the air, strobe lights painting the crowd in flashes of electric color, drinks flowing, the city's most stylish mingling, and the energy at its peak amid this vibrant chaos. Kirk Frost and young Jock appeared to be dressed to impress. But their target was none other than Lil Scrappy, a man known for lighting up any room with his infectious charisma. The tension was high during this unforgettable battle of emotions. Drama and confrontation, built slowly with a few acerbic glances, quiet conversations, hey, and a storm simmering just below the surface. And then it happened. The atmosphere quickly changed from joyous to stunned, and before long, the dance floor center was transformed into a spectacle that everyone could not take their eyes off of. Some people frantically grabbed their phones to record the drama, while others froze, too shocked to react. It wasn't just a disagreement, though. It was a full-fledged altercation that left the entire club buzzing. Wondering what led Kirk and Jock to confront Scrappy so boldly and how intense it got before the security personnel finally arrived. The main dance floor was a mass of moving, bodies swaying to the DJ's latest set, and the strobe lights flickered in time with the heavy bass, giving brief, fragmented glimpses of faces captured. However, the energy inside the Atlanta nightclub was already reaching its peak. It was the kind of night that people had been talking about for weeks, complete with loud music, flashing lights, and a crowd that seemed to get more electrified with every minute. The line to enter had stretched around the block, attracting some of the city's most fashionable and well-connected faces. Up in the VIP area, a different kind of energy was developing. Wasn't about celebrating, though, as Kirk Frost and young Jock were seated in their reserved booth with their entourages buzzing around them. The two men looked sharp, wearing designer jackets and accessories that subtly screamed success. At first glance, they appeared relaxed, laughing and chatting while sipping expensive liquor. Small groups were gathered near the bar, balancing their cocktails and shouting over the noise. There was a certain edge to their interactions that hadn't been present on any of their previous high-profile nights out. Those around them either didn't notice or were too busy enjoying the benefits that came with being associated with two of the city's most recognizable figures. Across the room, in another VIP booth, Lil Scrappy was the center of scene, where Kirk and Jock seemed introspective. Scrappy exuded pure charisma as he stood up. More closely, Kirk's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and Jock's laugh came a fraction of a second too late. Among a close-knit group of friends, he was clearly enjoying himself as his laugh boomed. Over the music, his arms moved in time with the beat, and his smile was contagious. Drinks were raised quickly, and many people stopped by to pay their respects. Scrappy had long been known for his magnetic personality, the kind that turned ordinary nights into unforgettable events. Tonight seemed no different, but behind the scenes, things weren't as carefree as they appeared. Kirk and Juke exchanged a series of glances toward Scrappy's booth, which wasn't immediately apparent. A waitress bringing a tray of drinks to their booth hesitated when she felt the shift, her eyes flickering from Kirk's set jaw to Jock's narrowed eyes. She put the tray down without saying anything and hurried on, but the subtle signs started to pile up as the minutes went by. Kirk leaned closer to the Jock, his mouth moving quickly as the music roared on. Jock's expression darkened for a moment before he nodded, his gaze steadily on Scrappy. Whatever they were talking about, it was obviously not small talk. Glasses with a few familiar faces along the way. If he knew that the other side of the club was watching him, he didn't show it. The Jock watched him go, his jaw tightening as he leaned closer to Kirk. "You see what I'm seeing?" Quay said, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the pounding bass. Red responded right away. Nation was fixed on Scrappy's every move, but eventually added, yes, he said in a measured tone. The same events and crossed paths on the same stages. Although their public interactions had frequently appeared to be amicable enough, those close to them knew that there were underlying tensions. Scrappy's rising star status, his self-assured personality, and his reputation for speaking his mind made him both a beloved and divisive figure for Kirk and Jock. It wasn't just about the man himself. It was about what he stood for. Some saw Scrappy's carefree attitude and growing popularity as a threat, especially if it, as the DJ switched to a new song, the entire dance floor erupted. The lights flashed more quickly. The crowd grew closer together, and the night's energy reached a new peak. Kirk and Jock got out of their booth, and without saying anything to their group, they started to weave through the crowd, cutting a path directly towards Scrappy. Meanwhile, he was completely engrossed in the music on the edge of the dance floor, and he gestured to a few fans who called out his name, lifting his glass in recognition. He didn't notice Kirk and Jock. When the crowd turned to watch, the two men's confident, measured steps stood out from the chaotic movements of the dancers around them. By the time Scrappy looked up, it was too late to avoid them. Kirk stopped, a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, while the Jock took a step closer. The air around them seemed to change the music, and a sudden, heavy silence fell over their immediate area. Scrappy lowered his drink slightly, his smile dimming, and his posture straightened as he assessed the situation. Kirk didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at NG. "You've been running your mouth. Oh, know what I mean, Scrappy?" Raised an eyebrow, his grip tightening on the glass in his hand. A few of them stood with their eyes locked on Kirk and Juke. The unspoken tension between the two groups was palpable. And the small circle of onlookers leaned in, sensing that something was about to happen. He looked confidently back at his booth, where his crew was now on full alert. A few whispered to each other, but no one moved, so he knew that Scrappy was the one at the confrontation. He turned back to Kirk and Jock, studying his posture, and said, "If you have anything to say it." Jock stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His body language was calm, but there was no mistaking the tension in his eyes. "We've got plenty to say," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. "And if you're smart, you'll listen." Scrappy didn't back down, though. "Ooh, yeah, what?" He asked, his tone edging defiance, balled into a fist at his side. He appeared ready to defend himself for the first time. He took a small step forward and was now standing almost toe-to-toe with the Jock. The crowd around them shifted uneasily, with some moving back and others moving closer, drawn by the tension of an unfolding conflict. The nightclub CL was no longer just a place for dancing and drinking. The area where Kirk Frost, young Jock, and Lil Scrappy stood had turned into a hotspot. The music continued to thump, the lights continued to flash, and people continued to laugh and dance. But in this corner of the room, the atmosphere was completely Scrappy's. Crew was on high alert, and they all held their breath, their eyes darting. Between the three men, some were standing, while others were covered near the booth, their conversations hushed but urgent. A few of them exchanged uneasy glances as they tried to read the situation. Scrappy himself was still in a verbal standoff with Kirk and Jock. He was no stranger to conflict, but something about it felt different. It wasn't a heated exchange on a TV set with cameras rolling, and the stakes were personal. He pointed the finger at Scrappy, saying, "You've been talking out of line and spreading lies. You think you can just run your mouth and not face the consequences?" Scrappy lifted his chin and narrowed his eyes, saying, "If I have something to say, I'll say it." Kirk stepped forward, his face colder than ever, saying, "But don't come at me with these weak accusations unless you have something solid. We have more than just words, Scrappy. We have receipts. You want to deny what you've been saying?" Behind our Scrappy's jaw tightened as he held up the screen. He squinted at whatever was displayed, but the weight of Kirk's gesture said enough. "You're going to show me context messages." "That's your proof, miss?" "Mimasa, with that nonsense," he said, waving a dismissive hand, but his voice was less certain than before. A slight crack in his confidence beginning to show that his bravado remained intact. Bubato's posture told a different story. He leaned back almost imperceptibly, as if preparing for the next move. Close, Clocosio Kirk, almost shoulder to shoulder, he said. You've been playing both sides, saying one thing to us and another to everyone else. It's time to own up before it gets worse. Scrappy's anger boiled over, so he squared his shoulders and planted his feet, facing the two men directly. You think you can come in here and press me? Who do you think you are? He said, and then abruptly Kirk stepped forward, invading Scrappy's personal space. His voice was so low that it was almost drowned out by the music, but still loud enough to send shivers down Scrappy's spine. Seemed like everything would blow up at that moment, and the jock clenched his fists. Kirk's eyes narrowed, and Scrappy's crew edged closer, ready to jump in. At that moment, the crowd around them fell into a tense silence. The music and lights nearly meaningless, and everyone was watching, waiting for what felt inevitable. But instead of flinching, Scrap didn't. He stood his ground, his gaze locked with Kirk's, and he said, "You don't scare me." Stepping between them, he said, "All right, that's enough." His voice was a hand on Kirk's shoulder and gently but firmly pushed him back a step. Take it outside or take a seat. Kirk didn't resist, but he kept his eyes fixed on Scrappy, and as his stance remained defensive, the jock relaxed a little, stepping back as well. Scrappy exhaled slowly, his posture loosening as the immediate threat passed. His crew remained, their eyes darting between Scrappy and the two men who had been inches away from delivering the first punch. The security guard gestured for Kirk, and the jock to return to, "I don't care who you are," he said in an uncompromising tone. "This isn't the place for that." For a brief moment, it appeared as though Kirk and Jock might refuse, but Kirk nodded and put his phone back in his pocket. "We'll settle this another time," he said, making his voice low enough that only those closest could hear him. Before turning and walking away with Kirk back toward their VIP section, Scrappy didn't move at first. Instead, he stood motionless, his breath still a little heavier than usual as his crew started muttering around him. "Leaning in you. Good, man?" they asked in a tone full of concern. "I'm good," Scrappy said, though there was a hint of lingering tension in his voice. He picked up his drink, took a slow sip, and turned toward his booth. They were all talking always. Had been, but as he sat down, he couldn't get rid of the feeling that this wasn't over. The looks Kirk and Jock had given him when they had first approached him. As the night wore on, the tension persisted. Kirk and Juke had returned to their booth, but they weren't drinking or talking like before. Instead, they sat quietly, their faces set in stone eyes. Scrappy, on the other hand, had tried his best to shake off the confrontation. Back in his booth, he was surrounded by his crew, who were obviously still on edge. They spoke in hushed tones and had tense body language, as if any sudden move might set things off again. Scrappy sipped his drink, maintaining his composure, but those closest to him could see that the encounter had left him unsettled. The energy between them had shifted from being a couple looking for a good time to being a couple wah scared. Not exactly, but he knew that this wasn't over. And he was correct. Word of the altercation quickly spread throughout the club, and people who had witnessed it started sharing what they saw, embellishing details for dramatic effect. One woman said that Kirk and Juke had been prepared to swing, while a man at the bar told his friends that Scrappy had stood them down like a champ. It didn't matter that the confrontation customers began taking out their phones, and the story was already taking on a life of its own. A shaky video that was taken from across the room started making the rounds on social media, showing only Kirk and the jock standing in front of Scrappy. The tension was evident, but it was night that had placed them at the center of a viral moment. Kirk checked his phone and saw as the comments poured in. Some people were supporting him, and the jock was saying that Scrappy had finally gotten what he deserved. Others were firmly in Scrappy's corner, applauding his ability to stand his ground. The public spectacle added fuel to the fire, and Kirk's frustration increased. He leaned toward the jock and showed him the screen, talking like we're the bad guys. Kirk muttered in a low, tense voice that we started this. The jock shook his head saying it's just noise, but maybe it's time we set the record straight. Kirk nodded, but his expression didn't soften. As the crew watched the same social media storm play out on their phones, one of his friends turned the screen in his direction and said, "You're a legend, man." In an attempt to lighten the mood, he said, "They're calling you the king of the club." Scrappy forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, sure," he said, but he pointed to Kirk and Jock's booth where they were sitting, plotting. "You think this is the end?" Nah, they're just getting started." As the club started to wind down, the crowd thinned out, and people were still talking about what had happened and exchanging stories as they filed. Ed out into the Kirk and Jock finally got up. They hadn't had another drink or spoken much to each other since the confrontation. The tension between them and Scrappy was so great that words weren't needed. They exchanged a glance and Kirk nodded toward the exit before saying, "Let's go." Some people lingered in the parking lot, wondering what would happen next. The buzz had reached a fever pitch, and everyone who had been there that night felt like they were part of something bigger than just a night out. It was a narrative that everyone wanted to follow. Followed without question, and the two men left the club as quietly as they had approached earlier in the evening. However, their silence didn't mean they were finished. Rather, it meant they were preparing for their next move. Scrappy watched them go from the other side of the room, his jaw clenched, thinking they were simply going to leave and come at me another day. His best friend leaned in and whispered something to him, but Scrappy simply shook his head, saying, "No, this ain't over." The air was cooler outside the club, but the atmosphere was still charged because a group of people had gathered. Some of them were scrolling through their phones near the valet station, while others were talking excitedly about what had happened that night. Kirk and Juke passed them without saying anything, but some people turned to watch. Even though their presence carried weight, people moved aside to give them space, as if the tension from the club was still following them. They got into their car, closed the doors, and drove away. The glow from their phones lit up the interior as they scrolled through the online reactions. And for every person who was complimenting Scrappy's poise, someone else was calling. Kirk's face hardened as he read the comments in his eyes. He nodded slowly. They didn't need to explain that the altercation in the club may have ended, but the real fight was just getting started. That's where we stand, my friends. Tensions. Our boiling alliances are falling apart, and questions are still unanswered. Now it's your turn. What do you think actually happened in that nightclub? Do you think Kirk and Jock have something to prove? Or is Scrappy just the latest target of some backstage drama? Share your thoughts in the comments section below, and remember to hit the bell icon, like this video, and subscribe to the channel so you can be the first to know what happens next. I promise you, the story isn't finished yet. The fallout from this explosive night is only beginning.